All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at conspiracy theories.
Okay.
But we're going to kind of be approaching it from a slightly different angle than I think we have in the past.
Interesting.
We are going to be referencing a text called "Are You a Conspiracy Theorist?"
Okay.
And it basically lists, I think there's 6 statements that it analyzes in terms of how much they agree with common conspiracy beliefs.
Gotcha.
So we're not here to label anybody or anything like that, but we're going to use these statements and this text as a jumping off point to really dig into the psychology behind why people find these ideas so compelling.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's really important to understand kind of, what the root of these ideas is and why people, latch onto them.
Right, exactly. And so the first statement here is television mostly spreads lies. I mean, haven't we all kind of felt that at times?
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone has those moments where you're scrolling through the news or, you're watching something and you just get that feeling like, is this real? Is this,
Right.
Is this actually what's happening?
Yeah, and the text points out that this statement really plays on a very real thing, which is media bias.
Right.
And we know that media outlets have agendas.
For sure.
Sometimes they're political, sometimes they're financial.
Right.
But the psychology gets really interesting here.
Yeah.
It's something called the illusory truth effect.
Okay.
Which basically means that the more we hear something repeated, even if it's false, the more we're likely to believe it is true.
That makes sense.
And then you combine that with our natural tendency towards confirmation bias.
Right.
Where we're seeking out information that already confirms our existing beliefs.
Exactly.
And it's like a recipe for misinformation.
Totally. And so a good example of this is let's say you are someone who's inclined to believe in, certain conspiracy theories about, let's say, health and wellness.
Okay.
If you're constantly seeing, articles or videos or social media posts that are reinforcing those beliefs, even if they don't have, credible sources or they're based on, misinformation, the fact that you're seeing it over and over again can make it feel more and more true,
right,
even though it might not be.
And then it's like a feedback loop.
Yeah.
You see a biased news story.
I see it.
Confirms your suspicions.
Right.
Then you're more likely to believe the next biased story that you see.
Exactly. It just kind of keeps perpetuating itself.
Right. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Totally.
And so this kind of leads into the next statement, which is that truly independent news media are rare.
Right.
And again, I think there's a kernel of truth in this one.
Oh, for sure.
Media consolidation is a real concern. Corporate interests can definitely influence coverage. But to say that all media are controlled by shadowy forces I think is a pretty big leap.
Yeah, I think that's where we start to get into really black and white thinking.
Okay.
And it kind of ignores the nuances of, how media actually works.
Right.
I mean, there are definitely, outlets that have biases and agendas.
Sure.
But to say that they're all, controlled by some sort of evil force,
right,
is a little bit simplistic.
Yeah. And I think this is where the psychological need for control comes into play.
Yeah, totally.
Because, conspiracy theories offer this sense of order in a world that feels really chaotic.
Right.
They make you feel like you're in the know.
Yeah, you figured it out.
Yeah, I figured out the real story.
Exactly. It's like that feeling of having secret knowledge that most people don't have.
Exactly. And, that's like that feeling of being in a secret club.
Right.
Knowing something that the sheeple don't.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost empowering in a way.
It can be. And that sense of empowerment can be, quite addictive for some people.
Right.
Because it makes them feel like they have a sense of control in a world that often feels very much out of control.
Right. So then the next statement is that power wants to keep us ignorant to better control us. Which, kind of taps into this deep-seated fear of manipulation.
Right.
Which I think is understandable.
Totally.
Given, historical examples of governments withholding information or spreading propaganda.
Exactly. We've seen that happen time and time again throughout history.
Right.
So it's not like this fear comes from nowhere.
Right.
But I think where it gets tricky is when we start to assume that all authority figures are inherently deceptive.
Okay.
Because that can lead to a really cynical and disempowering worldview.
Right. If you can't trust anybody,
Exactly. It's who do you turn to for information?
Yeah.
Who do you trust? And it can also lead to this kind of slippery slope fallacy where we start to think, well, if they lied about this one thing, then they must be lying about everything.
Right.
And that's not always necessarily the case.
Right. So how do we find that balance between healthy skepticism and just outright paranoia?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think this is where critical thinking skills really come into play.
Okay.
We need to be able to evaluate information from multiple sources, consider different perspectives, recognize logical fallacies,
Right.
And not just kind of blindly accept everything that we hear.
So like the next statement kind of is a good example of what you're talking about. It says, if an authority says it, the majority will blindly believe it.
Right.
And that's just not true.
No, and that's actually a classic example of the appeal to authority fallacy,
Right.
which is, just because someone in a position of power says something doesn't automatically make it true.
Right.
We still need to look at the evidence. We
Yeah.
need to, critically evaluate what's being said. It's like that thing, like believing everything on the internet, just because it's written in like a really nice font.
Exactly.
Okay, so the next one kind of throws a little curveball, I think.
Okay.
It says, real power does not belong to politicians, but to those who control them.
Mm.
And this is interesting because
Yeah.
this idea of puppet masters is a really recurring theme in a lot of conspiracy theories.
Absolutely. It plays into this, this deep-seated fear that we have that things are not what they seem,
Right.
that there's this hidden power structure that's really calling the shots.
Yeah.
And while it's true that, lobbying and corporate influence and, those kinds of things do play a role in politics.
Sure.
To say that, like, all power rests in the hands of these, unseen forces,
Right.
I think is an oversimplification.
Yeah.
It kind of ignores the complexities of how political systems actually work.
Right.
It's also a way of, I think, sometimes shifting blame and avoiding personal responsibility.
Because if we believe that everything is controlled by this, this shadowy cabal, then it kind of lets us off the hook for, participating in the political process for trying to make a difference.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Because it's like, why bother
right.
if the Illuminati are going to rig the election anyway?
Like, my vote doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Which leads perfectly into the final statement, which is, the real rulers of the world are barely known and operate in the shadows.
Oh, the classic conspiracy theory.
Right. Like that is like
the starter kit.
Yeah, this idea of a secret society controlling global events. I mean, it's everywhere.
It is. And it's so pervasive because it speaks to our desire for simple explanations.
Okay.
Our need to believe that someone somewhere is in control.
Right.
Because the reality is, the world is messy and chaotic and unpredictable.
Sure.
And it's a lot easier to think that there's this group of, evil masterminds that are pulling the strings than it is to accept the fact that sometimes things just happen.
Right. Things are random.
Exactly.
Like, what does all this mean for the listener?
Well, I think the key takeaway here is that it's really important to be aware of our own biases.
Okay.
To understand, how our brains are wired to look for patterns to try to make sense of the world.
Right.
Because once we understand that, then we can start to be more critical of the information that we're consuming.
Okay.
And we can start to, differentiate between healthy skepticism and just kind of like blanket distrust of everything.
So basically just, be a little bit more mindful about what you're reading and what you're sharing.
Yeah. Do your own research.
Yeah.
Don't just take things at face value.
Exactly.
Question everything.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this deep dive on conspiracy theories.
Yeah, this was fun.
Until next time, stay curious.